Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to focus on another case study and turn our attention to institutional issues surrounding sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. I want to start off lecture by stating a few things. First, I have chosen to focus on the Catholic Church because of the widespread abuse that has been occurring at the hands of priests, for decades. This lecture is not meant to be an attack against the Church or against Catholics in general. I hope you do not perceive it that way. However, there have been massive issues within the Church over the years, and not just surrounding this topic either. As someone who has grown up Catholic myself, I understand how sensitive this topic can be for many Catholics and is often not something that they want to discuss, especially for individuals of older generations. Anything that may paint the Church in a negative light is not something that many want to discuss openly. But we have to, as a way to support those who have been victimized by the priests and by the institution overall. Let's go ahead and get started with a discussion of the Church as an institution from a general perspective. The Roman Catholic Church is one of the world's oldest institutions and also one of the most influential. The Church has a lot of power and influence and begins with the apostles following Jesus and his teachings. The current church leaders, specifically the bishops, are direct successors to Jesus' 12 apostles. The Roman Catholic Church is the largest Christian church in the world and has more than 1.2 billion members. 2.1 billion people identify as Christian of some denomination, but roughly half of that 2.1 billion is Catholic. To put that in another perspective, the world's population is roughly 7.4 billion people. So about 16%, or a little more than 1/7 of the world's population, is Catholic. Islam has roughly 1.3 billion believers, so only slightly more than the entire Catholic Church. That tells you a little bit about how large of an institution this really is. The head of the Church is the Pope, otherwise known as the Bishop of Rome. Pope Francis is the current Pope, and he is the 266th man to hold this seat. He is in charge of the entire Church. All clergy and parishioners answer to the Pope. Pope Francis is Argentinian and is the first man from the Americas to be elected Pope. He is the successor to Pope Benedict XVI. This man, Pope Benedict XVI, is important to our discussion, which is why I bring him up now. So the Pope is the head of the Church. He lives in the Apostolic Palace located in the Vatican City, which is enclaved within Rome, Italy. It is located within the country of Italy, but it is technically not part of Italy. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Within the Church, there is a hierarchy of clergy that the Pope presides over. At the base level, you have parishes. A parish is one specific church where you may attend Mass. A priest holds Mass, but is not in charge of the entire church. Each church has a pastor who is in charge of any priests or deacons located at a specific church. Clusters of parishes are overseen by a diocese based on population and geographic boundaries. Think of a diocese much like you would a county. If a parish is a city, the diocese is the county. Bishops are in charge of the diocese and oversee all of the lower-ranking clergy underneath them. Then, archdioceses are comprised of clusters of dioceses. Archbishops oversee all of the bishops and additionally lower clergy members. The Pope is the one who appoints all bishops, archbishops, and cardinals. Cardinals are the only clergy members who are directly lower than the Pope himself. Think of cardinals in a similar way to a presidential cabinet. Some of these men serve as advisors to the Pope in addition to their regular congregational duties. But the primary purpose of the cardinals is really to elect a new pope when the previous one passes away or abdicates the papacy. Typically, the pope dies rather than abdicates, but it has happened 5 times out of the previous 265 popes. Anyway, cardinals live all over the world, but there are some who live in the Vatican City with the Pope himself. The Vatican City, or the location of the head of the Church, is often referred to as the Holy See. Women are not allowed to be priests in the Catholic Church. They may become nuns, but do not hold any power within the hierarchical structure of the Church. All clergy members must take a vow of celibacy once they become clergy within the Church. As we stated earlier, the Vatican is located in Vatican City, which is the center of Rome, Italy. It is the capital of the Catholic Church. Normally, when you're talking about a capital, that sounds like something that would be found within a state or within a country. Well, the same is true here. In 1929, the Vatican became a city-state by the Lateran Treaty. This separates out the Vatican from Italy and allows for the separation of jurisdiction. With this treaty, the Holy See now becomes in charge of 100+ acres of what will become known as Vatican City. This means that anything and everything that happens within those 110 acres is under the direct jurisdiction of the Church. In essence, the Church is its own country with all of the privileges that go along with national sovereignty. The only thing to mention here is that the Roman Catholic Church is one of the richest institutions in the entire world. The money that the Church controls is extreme, and they keep getting richer year after year. If you have ever been to a Catholic Mass, right before communion, the collection baskets are passed around. Other churches do this as well, but the Catholic Church is built around the idea that parishioners are nearly required to contribute to the cause. While we don't know exactly how much money the Vatican Bank has due to the fact that many countries do not require the Vatican to report their financial holdings, it is estimated that the Vatican Bank manages over $64 billion in customer assets, owns over $764 million in its own equity, and has gold reserves of at least $20 million in the U.S. Federal Reserve at Fort Knox. In 2014, the Vatican Bank reported $76 million in net profit. That's what we knowingly estimate. Not everything the Vatican owns is on the balance sheets, however. Artwork, some properties, religious items such as gold chalices, for instance, are not always recorded the way that other businesses and organizations are required to record assets. However, the total rumored wealth of the Church, with all things considered, ranges somewhere between $400 billion to $2 trillion. The only difference is that the Vatican does not have a military structure and is considered neutral territory in all foreign wars. The Vatican is protected by the Pontifical Swiss Guard, as you can see on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. As you may note, the Lateran Treaty was signed in 1929, which was post-World War I and pre-World War II. One of the first big issues that the Church would have to face as a newly established sovereign authority was the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. The Church was not exactly anti-Nazi for the simple reason that they were not communists. Communists tended to burn churches and liked to force out religion. Nazis did not. Despite the Church being somewhat aware of what the Nazis were doing even before the occupation of Rome, the Church never outright opposed Hitler. After the war, the Church was largely influential in helping many war criminals escape Europe. The Red Cross would provide new documentation and identities for those who had enough money to escape, and the Church would help protect the rat lines for those trying to flee. Provided, of course, that the escaping war criminals would be first baptized as Catholic and provide a sizable donation to the Church. So, as you can see, there are many benefits and several drawbacks to having the Church as a sovereign authority that is not overseen by anyone else. Keep this all in mind later when we discuss the issue of child sexual abuse and the role of the Church's sovereign authority. Like many institutions, the Catholic Church is governed by its own set of internal laws. This is called Canon Law. Canon Law is the internal rules and laws that are used to make sure both the clergy and parishioners are obeying the teachings of the Church. This indicates that there will be an internal punishment of some kind. When we are talking about punishment, it could be something as simple as basic penance, or it can go as far as excommunication in some cases. These laws affect both the clergy and the laity within the Church. So, for example, if a Catholic gets divorced, then they cannot be remarried within the Church, since marriage is considered a sacrament for Catholics. In order to be remarried within the Church, the first marriage must end due to the death of a spouse or through means of an annulment. However, divorce is not recognized, so therefore the punishment is not being able to be remarried in the Church. This punishment does not hold legal weight like a criminal sanction administered by the court system. You can still be legally married, you just cannot do so within the Catholic Church. The problem that we are facing in the discussion of the Church and child sexual abuse is that canon law also helps to protect clergy due to their perceived higher status in comparison to the laity. Because canon law is only an internal set of laws, they do not hold any weight with secular governments like we said before. You cannot be sent to prison for violating canon law, but depending on what you did, you might be excommunicated from the Catholic Church. There are only internal punishments associated with this type of law violation. This is the big catch though. Canon law states that it will prosecute any clergy or laity who violate canon law. This includes the sexual abuse of children within the church at the hands of priests. This is also against the law with secular governments. So the church says we will punish our priests and we will make sure they're not doing the things that they're not supposed to be doing. We will defrock them and excommunicate them when they do something as heinous and as extreme as child sexual abuse. After all, they're committing a secular crime, are violating their authority as a priest, and are also breaking their vow of celibacy. So many things are happening at one time. But did the church do that? Nope, they didn't. Not even a little bit. In many cases, they did the exact opposite. Over the last 50 years or so, the church was able to hide many of the abuses committed by their clergy because of their sovereign authority as a country. As long as the abuse was not made known to secular law enforcement first, then the church was able to simply relocate the priest in question. Anytime the church felt as though a victim might report the crime to secular law enforcement, or if there were too many victims in one location, the church would relocate the priest to a new parish. This could be in the same city or in the same state, or it could be in an entirely different location like a new country. In some extreme cases, when prosecution was very likely, or if the victim count was pretty high, then the priest had the option to go to the Vatican. Once they are located inside the Vatican, they are untouchable. The church will not extradite for prosecution purposes. And there you can see one of the biggest advantages of being its own sovereignty. In 1974, Pope Paul VI introduced the additional edict to the church, which states that clergy are able to require laity to stay silent regarding issues surrounding anything that would harm the reputation of the church. Known as the Pontifical Secret, or Secreta Continere, it is the code of confidentiality that can be implemented when there are extraordinary circumstances at play. For example, like when a priest sexually abuses a small child and that child or his or her family is ready to report to law enforcement. Not only does the Pontifical Secret extend to clergy, but it also extends to the laity, just like I just mentioned. Think of this as a last resort, last-ditch effort to keep the problem a secret. The church's best weapon is the threat of excommunication, meaning you can get kicked out of the church and are no longer allowed to be Catholic. For many Catholics, it is a very strong incentive to stay quiet. I don't want to be removed from my religion, so I stay quiet and comply with the church's instructions, even though I know this is the wrong thing to do. The Pontifical Secret is still in existence and allowed for the church to make the accusations against priests to simply go away. It was not until 2002 that the church began to comply with the pressures placed upon it by outside communities and required that all accusations of child sexual abuse made against priests be reported to secular legal authorities. This was reluctantly passed, but was necessary once the years of abuse and cover-up were revealed. The church was no longer able to make things simply disappear, but they had to do something to make it seem as though they were correcting the problem that they themselves created. The sexual abuse committed within the church is really a worldwide problem. You are going to watch a shorter documentary called Sex Crimes in the Vatican that focuses on sexual abuses committed in Ireland, the United States, and within Central America as well. The church has influence everywhere, and its power, and it has power, and the power that it wields is substantial. As I said earlier, the amount of money that the Vatican controls allows them to be able to make problems go away pretty easily. It is not difficult for the church to silence the poor rural individuals whose identities are strongly tied to the church. The first reported widespread abuses came out of Ireland, Canada, and Australia. Those came before the reports regarding U.S. abuses, which were revealed in the early 2000s. The United States reported abuses stemmed back 50 years and involved accusations against 4,000 priests in the United States alone. If that's what's occurring here in the U.S., imagine what's occurring all over the world. Think about what was happening in Europe, where the Catholic Church has a much larger and stronger presence than here in the Americas. So part of this scandal involved child sexual abuse, but the larger failure comes from the cover-up, or the fact that the church hid these accusations for decades and moved the priests to different parishes. When that happens, the church simply allowed for these offenders to find a new victim pool, and the offending begins once again. I want to spend a little bit of time discussing a partial timeline of abuse regarding what we know to happen in the United States. To begin with, in the 1960s, we see one of the first serial offending priests committing abuses against children who were attending the school that he worked for. This specific case was explained in the HBO documentary Mea Maxima Culpa, Silence in the House of God. This documentary interviews 4 men who were sexually abused by former father Lawrence Murphy at St. John's School for the Deaf in Minnesota. Think about the 1960s and the amount of absolute trust that priests probably had at the time. It was not an era in which people were having open and honest conversations about sexual abuse like we are today. It was a time in which these things happened but were never discussed in any way, shape, or form. They just went away. These boys tried to report their abuses to the church, but the church made them keep quiet, as we mentioned before. If you have HBO and want to watch this documentary, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's one of the better ones that I have seen in relation to this topic. In 1985, we see the first reports of a priest who is criminally prosecuted for abusing young boys in his parish. Former Father Gilbert Gath pled guilty to 11 counts of child molestation against these young boys. However, it is estimated that he abused more than 100 children during his time as a priest. He served 10 years in prison and was defrocked by the church. But what is interesting is that at the time, this was thought to be a strange and solely isolated instance of child sexual abuse within the church. People still could not believe that priests were capable of this type of abuse. This has to be an isolated instance. Goth was an anomaly and was not the norm. Priests are trusted and they aren't harming our children. That's what we thought. In 1997, he pled no contest to the abuse of another child while living in Texas and served probation for that offense. He then failed to register as a sex offender and went to prison for an additional 2 years. He currently lives in Lamarck, Texas. In 1992, we see the first admission by anyone connected to the church that these abuses were happening and that cover-ups were also occurring. It is against the norm for anyone, especially bishops, to outright admit something that will harm the reputation of the church. 10 years later, in 2002, the real story begins to be exposed. We will talk about Boston more in a few minutes, but reporters from the Boston Globe began to report on abuses that were taking place locally. The response to the story is so strong and matches what is happening all over the world that the Vatican is forced to respond and publishes guidelines on what to do when abuse is found out. Simply report these cases to Rome and we will deal with it. Excuse me. This is really the issue that we keep running into. Only sending these priests to Rome is going to keep them from being prosecuted, and that's what we don't want. There cannot be any more protection for those people who are abusing children. Later the same year, the church reverses course and states that there is a zero-tolerance policy against anyone who commits a sex crime against a child. However, they still desire to protect the privacy of priests. Mainly, this equates to, please don't put them on the American Sex Offender Registry. We don't want them to be subjected to the same ridicule as other sex offenders. They are still priests after all. In response to the church's plea for privacy for these priests, an advocacy group called Survivors First released the name of 573 U.S. priests who had been accused of pedophilia. They blew the church's request right out of the water and made their identities public. It was a bold and necessary action in order to show the church they are not willing to be silenced any longer. 2 years later, we see an investigative report released by the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City stating that for over the last 50 years, more than 4,000 priests have been accused of sexually assaulting more than 10,000 children in the United States, the majority of which are young boys. Only 150 of these priests were successfully prosecuted during that time. The rest were protected, to some extent, by the church. This typically involved relocation and reluctance to defrock these men. As you can see from this quote from Bishop Blaise Kupich, that the church believes all that we need to do is get these individuals into treatment, fix the problem, and then they can get back to their jobs. Nowhere in this quote is there a call for prosecution or for the offender to be held accountable. In 2012, we see the first and one of the only individuals to be held accountable for the cover-ups. Monsignor William Lynn is sentenced to 3 to 6 years in prison for failing to report the abuse and for relocating a priest under his protection while working in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. So speaking more specifically about Boston, in 2002, the Boston Globe reports that one individual priest, John Gagan, abused more than 130 people between 1962 and 1995. If you know anything about Boston and the surrounding areas, there is a strong Catholic presence in that city. There are a lot of Irish Catholics in the area, and they are very reluctant to believe anything that goes against the teachings of the church. As you can imagine, these individuals do not want to believe the accusations that the Globe was making. The Globe experienced a lot of kickback from the story. In that same year, the Globe reported that Cardinal Bernard Law knew what was happening with the sexual abuse that was being committed by Gagan, and instead of reporting them to law enforcement, they simply relocated the offending priest to a different parish so he could continue his work without interference. From the pictures on your screen, you can see the two men that are sitting here. The top man in the suit is Gagan, and the bottom man is Cardinal Law. Gagan was found guilty in criminal court of molesting one boy in a swimming pool and was sentenced to prison in 2002. This particular molestation happened in 1991, and he was defrocked by Pope John Paul II in 1998. So this is one of the more rare cases in which a priest is defrocked before any criminal charges occur. This indicates that the church knew about the abuse and simply chose to do nothing in terms of prosecuting the crime other than to handle it internally. This is what we are continually seeing within the church itself and its desire to keep all of these cases out of the eyes of the general public. This is done in order to uphold the reputation of the church and to make sure that parishioners still have faith in the church as an institution. Gagan was sentenced to 9 to 10 years in prison, but less than a year after his sentencing, he was strangled to death by his cellmate in the maximum security prison that he was incarcerated in. The man who killed him said he had planned the murder for more than a month and considered the murder to be justified based on what the former priest had done. As for Cardinal Law, he resigned from his archbishop position in December 2002 and relocated to Rome in 2004. He died in late 2017 while still living in Rome. As I said earlier, this particular case involves more than 130 individuals who were sexually abused between 1962 and 1995. Initially, these particular victims had entered into a $30 million settlement with the Boston Archdiocese, but later the Archdiocese revised that settlement and lowered the amount to only $10 million. However, this settlement only applied to Gagin's victims. In larger settlements, the Boston Archdiocese had to pay more than $100 million to over 500 of the victims who were abused in the surrounding area of Boston. This settlement was so large that the Archdiocese had to sell land and buildings to pay the settlement so that they could avoid bankruptcy. This slide comes from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, which is directly linked to the Church. This slide shows the total number of accusations of sexual abuse that were made against clergy and that were investigated in the Catholic Church from 2006 to 2012, so roughly covering a 7-year period. Remember that during this time period, we're only covering the investigations rather than when the abuses themselves occurred. So for example, in 2008, this was a peak year for investigations. In total, 803 accusations were investigated, and of that 803 total, 708 of them were deemed to be true or substantiated. That indicates that in less than 12% of those cases, they were deemed to be false or unsubstantiated. This trend continues over the course of the 7 years of investigations. From this chart, you can see that the victims are telling the truth and that they are being sexually assaulted by priests and other clergy within the Church. From this slide, you can see several of the larger settlements that the Catholic Church has had to make over the years to victims who have been accused, or who have accused priests of sexual assault. Remember that settlements take place in civil courts, so even if the settlement was made, this does not guarantee that those priests in question were ever prosecuted in criminal court. Let's take a look at some of the larger ones. We've already talked about Boston and how they had to make over a $100 million settlement for more than 500 victims. Other dioceses and archdioceses had similar or larger settlements with their victims, and the biggest one that stands out here is the Los Angeles Archdiocese, which paid more than $660 million to 508 victims. Other large settlements surround the Diocese of San Diego, the Diocese of Orange County, California, and the Diocese of Covington, Kentucky. In total, the settlement was made to 2,233 settlement victims from those settlements that are shown on your screen, and the settlements equate to a staggering $1.344 billion. Now you can see what I was talking about earlier, and when I talked about the amount of money and resources that the Vatican has in its disposal to be able to settle with victims of sexual abuse. The settlements that you see on your screen are some of the biggest ones in recent history. These are by no means the only settlements that have occurred with the Catholic Church. Here is a different way of looking at the settlements again. This information comes from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. This is the same source of the previous infographic that came from as well. So looking at a similar time frame, you can see here that this includes the total spending that the Church has had to spend on sexual abuse allegations. From the previous slide, I just provided you information regarding the settlements, and this slide shows the total spending. So if you take into account the settlements, therapy for victims, support for offenders, legal fees such as attorney costs, and other costs in a catch-all category, you can see that this equates to roughly $2.6 billion that the Church has had to spend from 2004 to 2012. This is just related to sexual abuse allegations. So now let's talk a little bit about the Vatican and how the cover-ups were authorized from higher level authorities within the Church. Very recently, Pope John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and current Pope Francis have all publicly condemned pedophile priests within any ranking inside the Catholic Church. These public statements were made as a way to show congregations that the Church is doing something about the allegations and that the Church as a whole does not tolerate this type of behavior from any of its clergy members. However, the public statements often contradict the actions that were taken inside the Church itself. As you can see from this slide, I have two pictures here. One man is in both pictures. In the top picture of your screen, the man on the right, sitting dressed completely in white, is Pope John Paul II, who is now deceased. The man on the left was then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later goes on to become Pope Benedict XVI. Benedict later resigns and opens the door for the current Pope Francis, who you can see on the bottom picture on the left. And the reason that I bring up all three of these men is because Cardinal Ratzinger, or Pope Benedict XVI, is the link that holds all three men together. While John Paul II was Pope, Ratzinger was the individual who presided over the office that handled all sexual abuse allegation cases. That office basically did nothing except to keep the victims quiet under the edict of papal secrecy. Ratzinger did nothing to internally prosecute these clergy members who were committing sexual abuses until he received an explicit order from Pope John Paul II to start doing so. There is documentation that Ratzinger received thousands of letters detailing allegations of sexual abuse while he was the head of the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Many of these letters are archived, but Ratzinger did not do anything to handle the situation other than to authorize the relocation of many of the offenders. He even received documentation surrounding Father Lawrence Murphy, the priest who sexually abused the young boys at the School for the Deaf that we talked about earlier. Once Murphy fell terminally ill, Ratzinger halted Murphy's trial and simply let the man pass away naturally. Nothing else was done in this specific case. One of the biggest criticisms that Ratzinger faced once he became Pope Benedict XVI was this knowledge that he was at the center of the scandal and did nothing to help the victims of sexual assault. It was one of the reasons why he became a pretty unpopular pope, and many critics say that this was one of the reasons why he resigned after only being pope for 8 years. As we stated at the beginning of the lecture, only 5 of the 265 popes have actually resigned. Before Pope Benedict XVI resigned, the last pope to do so was Pope Gregory XII, and he resigned in 1415. So as you can see, it's quite unusual for a pope to step down voluntarily, and most commonly, popes pass away, which opens the door for the election of a new pope. The last thing that I want to talk to you about in today's lecture is the idea of victim selection, grooming, and priest abuse of power. Earlier in the lecture, one of the things that I talked to you about was the idea of laity being very reluctant to believe that priests are capable of sexual assault, as they were being alleged to have committed. Within many faiths, not just the Catholic Church, we like to believe that our faith leaders are more ethical, can be trusted more, and are the perfect representation of the faith that we follow. And whenever something happens to disrupt that viewpoint of this individual, we are very reluctant to believe the accusations. If you were someone who wanted to sexually abuse children within your congregation, using this trust to your advantage would be a smart thing to do. No one is going to think that I'm capable of this, so I can commit these crimes and remain undetected. If you look at the majority of the abuse victims who have made allegations as adults now, you'll see a few things to be true. Typically, these victims were young, school-aged boys that either served as altar boys or have access to the priest by attending Catholic school. Most Catholic schools do have teachers who are not priests or nuns, but the school is typically connected to a church and has administrative ties with clergy. These priests would have access to these children pretty much all of the time. But in particular, they would focus on the children who came from broken homes, have single parents, were from low-income areas, or had developmental issues. These individuals were perfect because the parents would not be aware of what was going on, could have been totally absent from the child's life, or were simply not interested, or perhaps were relying on the priest to serve a parental role as a parental role model for the child if the parent was busy working or something of that nature. In essence, this allowed the priest to have a continuous victim pool to be able to abuse from. If you think about how much parents probably trusted priests at the time, they have no reason to believe that they could not leave their child around the priest. This man is relatively harmless. He would be a good influence for my child, and I can trust this individual to be around my kid. The priest then uses this trust to his advantage in order to be able to sexually abuse his victims. The other thing that the priests have on their side is the idea that as your spiritual leader, I have authority over you. Many priests use this authoritative role to their advantage in order to be able to groom victims into staying silent. Oftentimes, as we know, children can be manipulated into staying quiet. As a priest, one of the things that the offender would do would be to invoke a certain level of guilt onto the child in order to get that child to stay quiet. However, if this method would not work, remember that the priest can invoke a vow of silence on the child, and that the diocese would require the child to sign a formal vow of silence. If the child or the family member of the child reported to law enforcement or did something to make these abuse allegations known, then the child could be excommunicated. And as a young child, this is something that you definitely don't want to happen. My family is Catholic, my parents are Catholic, I attend a Catholic school, there's no way that I can't be Catholic too. So I'm going to keep quiet to keep the priest happy and not risk excommunication. Today we've gone through a lot of information surrounding the sexual abuses that were committed by priests within the Catholic Church. At the beginning of the lecture, I mentioned to you that this was not an attempt to bash the Catholic Church as an institution, and other faiths have also experienced issues with sexual assault among their faith leaders as well. However, as you can now see from this information presented in the lecture and from the readings, sexual abuse within the church are much more widespread and hushed up than in other denominations. To an extent, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church allowed this to continue for decades without any sort of punishment for those priests who engaged in sexual assault of children. The relocation efforts of the Vatican allowed these priests to find new victim pools time and time again and simply made the problem that much more worse. As you can see, many church officials knew about the abuses and did nothing to stop it through either internal means or by reporting these abuses to secular law enforcement. Once the scandal was made known to the general public, the church took some action to try and fix what they had done, but by then it was too late. This became a blemish of massive proportions on the church and caused many parishioners to lose faith in the church as an institution. For many years after these accusations were made public, the church had a membership problem and had to work extra hard to try and get membership back up. But for some, the damage was done and they will no longer be part of the Catholic Church as an institution. You will learn more about the situation from the documentary that you have to watch that is connected to the Catholic Church and to this sex scandal. Next time, we're going to head back into our discussions of the formal processing of sex offenders, and we're going to take a look at sex offender recidivism. Meet me back here next time when we look at Chapter 10. Thanks for your time and attention, and I hope to see you back here next time. Bye!